Rule-making. There is one significant omission from the above lists, although it is clearly implicit in both, and that is rule-making. The human species is addicted to rule-making. Every human activity, without exceptions, including natural biological functions such as eating and sex, is hedged about with complex sets of rules and regulations, dictating precisely when, where, with whom, and in what manner the activity may be performed. Animals just do these things. Humans make an almighty song and dance about it. This is known as civilization. The rules may vary from culture to culture, but there are always rules. Different foods may be prohibited in different societies, but every society has food taboos. We have rules about everything. In the above lists, every practice that does not already contain an explicit or implicit reference to rules could be preceded by the words rules about, for example, rules about gift giving, rules about hairstyles, rules about dancing, greetings, hospitality, joking, winning, etc. My focus on rules is therefore not some strange personal whim, but a recognition of the importance of rules and rule-making in the human psyche. If you think about it, we all use differences in rules as a principal meanings of distinguishing one culture from another. The first thing we notice when we go on holiday or business abroad is that other cultures have different ways of doing things, by which we usually mean that they have rules about, say, food, meal times, dress, greetings, hygiene, trade, hospitality, joking, status differentiation, etc., which are different from our own rules about these practices. Globalization and tribalization. Which brings us inevitably to the problem of globalization. During the research for this book, I was often asked by members of the chattering classes what was the point in my writing about Englishness, or indeed any other national identity, when the inexorable spread of American culture imperialism would soon make this an issue of purely historical interests. Already, I was told, we are living in a dumbed-down, homogenized macworld, in which the rich tapestry of diverse and distinctive cultures is being obliterated by the all-consuming consumerism of Nike, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Disney, and other multinational capitalist giants. Really, as a fairly typical Guardian reading, left rebel product of the anti-Thatcher generation, I have no natural sympathy for corporate imperialists, but as a professional observer of socio-cultural trends, I am obliged to report that their influence has been exaggerated, or rather misinterpreted. The principal effect of globalization, as far as I can tell, has been an increase in nationalism and tribalism, a proliferation of struggles for independence, devolution and self-determination, and the resurgence of concern about ethnicity and cultural identity in almost all parts of the world, including the so-called United Kingdom. Okay, perhaps not an effect. Correlation is not causation, as every scientist knows, but at the very least, one must acknowledge that the association of these movements with the rise of globalization is a striking coincidence. Just because people everywhere want to wear Nike trainers and drink Coke does not necessarily mean that they are any less fiercely concerned about their cultural identity. Indeed, many are prepared to fight and die for their nation, religion, territory, culture, or whatever aspect of tribal identity is perceived to be at stake. The economic influence of American corporate giants may indeed be overwhelming and even pernicious, but their cultural impact is perhaps less significant than either they or their enemies would like to believe. Given our deeply ingrained tribal instincts and increasing evidence of fragmentation of nations into smaller and smaller cultural units, it does not make sense to talk of a world of 6 billion people becoming a vast monoculture. The spread of globalization is undoubtedly bringing changes to the cultures it reaches, but this culture was not static in the first place, and change does not necessarily mean the abolition of traditional values. Indeed, new global media such as the internet have been an effective means of promoting traditional cultures, as well as the global subculture of anti-globalization activists. Within Britain, despite obvious American cultural influences, there is far more evidence of increasing tribalization than of any reduction in cultural diversity. The fervor and power of Scottish and Welsh nationalists did not seem to be much affected by their taste for American soft drinks, junk food, or films. Ethnic minorities in Britain are, if anything, increasingly keen to maintain their distinctive cultural identities, and the English are becoming ever more fretful about their own cultural identity crisis. In England, regionalism is endemic and escalating. Cornish nationalists are increasingly vociferous, and there has been some half-joking speculation that Yorkshire will be the next to demand devolution, and there is considerable resistance to the idea of being part of Europe, let alone part of any global monoculture. So I see no reason to be put off my attempt to understand Englishness by global warnings about the imminent extinction of this or any other culture. Class and race. When this book was in the planning stages, almost everyone I talked to about it asked whether I would have a chapter on class. My feeling all along was that a separate chapter would be inappropriate. Class pervades all aspects of English life and culture, and will therefore permeate all the areas covered in this book. Although England is a highly class-conscious culture, the real-life ways in which the English think about social class and determine a person's position in the class structure bear little relation either to simplistic three-tier upper middle working models or to the rather abstract alphabetical systems A, B, C1, C2, D, E, based entirely on occupation, favored by market research experts. A school teacher and an estate agent would both technically be middle class. They might even both live in a terraced house, drive a Volvo, drink in the same pub, and earn roughly the same annual income. But we judge social class in much more subtle and complex ways. Precisely how you arrange, furnish, and decorate your terraced house. Not just the make of car you drive, but whether you wash it yourself on Sundays, take it to a car wash, or rely on the English climate to sluice off the worst of the dirt for you. Similar fine distinctions are applied to exactly what, where, when, how, and with whom you eat and drink. The words you use and how you pronounce them, where and how you shop, the clothes you wear, the pets you keep, how you spend your free time, the chat-up lines you use, and so on. Every English person, whether we admit it or not, is aware of and highly sensitive to all of the delicate divisions and calibrations involved in such judgments. I will not therefore attempt to provide a crude taxonomy of English classes and their characteristics, but will instead try to convey the subtleties of English thinking about class through the perspectives of the different themes mentioned above. It is impossible to talk about class without reference to homes, gardens, cars, clothes, pets, food, drink, sex, talk, hobbies, etc., and impossible to explore the rules of any of these aspects of English life without constantly bumping into big class dividers or tripping over the smaller, less obvious ones. I will therefore deal with class demarcations as and when I lurch into them or stumble across them. At the same time, I will try to avoid being dazzled by class differences, remembering Orwell's point that such differences fade away the moment any two Britons are confronted by a European, and that even the distinction between rich and poor dwindles somewhat when one regards the nation from the outside. As a self-appointed outsider, a profession alien, if you like, might ask, in defining Englishness is to search for underlying commonalities, not to exclaim over surface differences. Race is a rather more difficult issue, and again was raised by all the friends and colleagues with whom I discussed this book. Having noted that I was conveniently avoiding issues of Scottish, Welsh, and Irish national identities by confining my research to the English rather than the British or the UK, they invariably went on to ask whether or not Asians, Afro-Caribbeans, and other ethnic minorities would be included in my definition of Englishness. There are several answers to these questions. The first is that ethnic minorities are included, by definition, in any attempt to define Englishness. The extent to which immigrant populations adopt, and in turn influence the culture and customs of their host country, particularly over several generations, is a complex issue. Research tends to focus on the adaptation and adoption elements, usually lumped together as acculturation, at the expense of the equally interesting and important issue of influence. This is odd. We acknowledge that short-term tourists can have a profound influence on their host cultures. Indeed, the study of the social processes involved has become a fashionable discipline in itself. But for some reasons, our academics seem less interested in the processes by which resident immigrant minority cultures can shape the behavior patterns, customs, ideas, beliefs, and values of the countries in which they settle. Although ethnic minorities constitute only about 6% of the population of this country, their influence on many aspects of English culture has been and is considerable. Any snapshot of English behavior as it is now, such as I am attempting here, will inevitably be colored by this influence. Although very few of the Asians, Africans, and Caribbeans living in England would define themselves as English, most call themselves British, which has come to be regarded as a more inclusive term. They have clearly contributed to the grammar of Englishness. My second answer to the race question concerns the more well-trodden area of acculturation. Here we come down to the level of the group and the individual rather than minority culture as a whole. To put it simply, perhaps too simply, some ethnic minority groups and individuals are more English than others. By this I mean that some, whether through choice or circumstance or both, have adopted more of the host culture's customs, values, and behavior patterns than others. This becomes a somewhat more complex issue in the second, third, and subsequent generations, as the host culture in question will have been influenced, at least to some degree, by their own forebears. Once you start to put it in these terms, the issue is really no longer one of race. When I say that some ethnic minority groups and individuals are more English than others, I am clearly not talking about the color of their skin or their country of origin. I am talking about the degree of Englishness they exhibit in their behavior, manner, and customs. I could and do make the same comment about white Anglo-Saxon groups and individuals. We all do, in fact. We describe a social group, a person, or even say just one of that person's reactions or characteristics, mannerisms, as very English or typically English. We understand what someone means when they say, in some way I'm very English, but in other ways I am not. Or you are more English about that than I am. We have a concept of degrees of Englishness. I am not introducing anything new or startling here. Our everyday use of these terms demonstrates that we all already have a clear grasp of the subtleties of partial Englishness or even piecemeal or cherry-picking Englishness. We recognize that we can all, at least to some extent, choose our degree of Englishness. All I am saying is that these concepts can be applied equally to ethnic minorities. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Englishness is rather more a matter of choice for the ethnic minorities in this country than it is for the rest of us. For those of us without benefit of early first-hand influence of another culture, some aspects of Englishness can be so deeply ingrained that we find it almost impossible to shake them off. Even when it is clearly in our interest to do so, such as in my case when trying to conduct field experiments involving queue jumping. Immigrants have the advantage of being able to pick and choose more freely, often adopting the more desirable English quirks and habits while carefully steering clear of the more ludicrous ones. I have some personal experience of such cultural cherry-picking. My family emigrated to America when I was 5, and we lived there for 6 years, during which entire time I steadfastly refused to adopt any trace of an American accent, on the grounds that it was aesthetically unpleasing. Sounds horrid was how I put it at the time. Dreadful little prig that I was. Although I happily adopted to most other aspects of the culture. As an adolescent, I lived for 4 years in rural France. I attended a local state school and became indistinguishable in my speech, behavior, and manners from any other Brian Kennedy teenager, except that I knew that this was a matter of choice and could judiciously shed those elements of Frenchness that annoyed my mother when I got home from school in the evening, or indeed deliberately exaggerate them to provoke her. Some teenage behaviors are universal. and discard those that proved socially unfavorable on our return to England. Immigrants can, of course, choose to go native, and some of these countries become more English than the English. Among my own friends, the two I would most readily describe as very English are a first generation Indian immigrant and a first generation Polish refugee. In both cases, their degree of Englishness was initially a conscious choice, and although it has since become second nature, they can still stand back and analyze their behavior and explain the rules they have learned to obey in a way that most native English find difficult, as we tend to take these things for granted. My sister had much the same experience when she married a Lebanese man and emigrated to Lebanon from America about 8 years ago. She became very quickly to her Bekaa Valley family and neighbors a fully acculturated Lebanese village housewife, but can switch back to Englishness, or Americanness, or indeed her teenage Frenchness, as easily as she changes languages, and often does both in mid-sentence. Her children are American Arab with a few hints of Englishness, and equally adept at switching language, manners and mores when it suits them. Many of those who pontificate about acculturation are inclined to underestimate this element of choice. Such processes are often described in terms suggesting that the dominant culture is simply imposed on unwitting passive minorities, rather than focusing on the extent to which individuals quite consciously, deliberately, cleverly, and even mockingly pick and choose among the behaviors and customs of their host culture. I accept that some degree of acculturation or conformity to English ways is often demanded or effectively enforced, although this would surely be true of any host culture unless one enters it as a conquering invader or passing tourist. And the rights and wrongs of specific demands can and should be debated. But my point is that compliance with such demands is still a conscious process, and not, as some accounts of acculturation imply, a form of brainwashing. My own way of understanding this process is to assume that every immigrant to this country is at least as bright and clever as I was when we emigrated to France, just as capable of exercising free will and maintaining a sense of their own cultural identity while complying with the demands, however irrational or unfair, of the local culture. I could crank up or tone down my Frenchness by subtle degrees in an entirely calculated manner. My sister can choose and calibrate her Arabness, and my immigrant friends can do the same with their Englishness, sometimes for practical social purposes, including the avoidance of exclusion, but also purely for amusement. Perhaps the earnest researchers studying acculturation just don't want to see that their subjects have got the whole things sussed, understand our culture better than we do, and are, much of the time, privately laughing at us. It should be obvious from all of this, but I'll say it anyway, that when I speak of Englishness, I'm not putting a value on it, not holding it up above any otherness. When I say that some immigrants are more English than others, I am not unlike Norman Tebbit with his infamous cricket test, implying that these individuals are in any way superior, or that their rights or status as citizens should be any different from those who are less English. And when I say that anyone can, given enough time and effort, learn or adopt Englishness, I'm not suggesting that they ought to do so. The degree to which immigrants and ethnic minorities should be expected to adapt to fit in with English culture is a matter for debate. Where immigrants from former British colonies are concerned, perhaps the degree of acculturation demanded should match that which we achieved as uninvited residents in their cultures. Of all peoples, the English are surely historically the least qualified to preach about the importance of adapting to host culture, manners, and mores. Our own track record on this is abysmal. Wherever we settle in any numbers, we not only create pockets of utterly insular Englishness, but also often attempt to impose our cultural norms and habits on the local population. But this book is intended to be descriptive, not prescriptive. I am interested in understanding Englishness as it is, words and all. It is not the anthropologist's job to moralize and pontificate about how the tribe she is studying ought to treat its neighbors or its members. I may have my opinions on such matters, but they are not relevant to my attempt to discover the rules of Englishness. I may sometimes state these opinions anyway. It's my book, so I can do what I like. But I will try to distinguish clearly between opinion and observation.